Last Sunday, after the Sunday service, I hopped on my bicycle and I went down to Woodbine Park near the lakeshore to attend a Buskers festival. Now, buskers are those street performers that you see in town squares, right? Often you see them in Europe more than here. And this festival had been put together by Epilepsy Toronto. And so it was a fundraiser. So you get down and you give them $10 at the door and you go in, and the whole park could be arranged so that there were various kiosks and food things, but there were entire stages set aside for buskers. And there were all the types of buskers that you'd think that there might be. There were fire eaters, so people who could swallow fire. There were jugglers. There was one guy from Argentina who could juggle up to 5 soccer balls at once, which he didn't get it the first time. It takes, but he managed to get all 5 up into the air. It's quite extraordinary. There was one guy who was into pogo sticks and unicycles, and he did all sorts of silly tricks on pogo sticks and unicycles. And he had one unicycle where the seat was this high, and he needed 3 guys to help him get onto the top of it, and then he rode around and stuff. And he juggled from up there, which is pretty impressive. And there were acrobats, and so there are all sorts of different types of buskers. And buskers, during their spiel, right, during their act, they're all kind of born comedians, they would all say the same thing. They would say, I'm glad you're enjoying the show, but at the end of the show, could you please throw some money into the hat? Because the way this works is, if you like our show, give us some money, and if you don't have to, but we're going to perform either way. And that's the way it works when you're a tourist, right? If you're in Europe, you come across a town square, there's all sorts of buskers doing their thing, and you don't have to pay them, and you can watch the show and walk away, or you can watch the show and throw them some money. And buskers have gotten high tech. They don't just, pass around the hat. They've also got QR codes so you can flash your phone and pay them that way, But they're all really hoping that you're going to pay. And one of the types of busker acts, though, that wasn't there, which usually is animal acts. There was one dog show off in a corner, but otherwise, there weren't any other animal shows. And you may remember that, there was a time when, there was the organ grinder with his monkey who would do tricks, right? And sometimes there'd be a dancing bear, or maybe a horse who seemed to be able to count, and answer math questions based on how many times it tapped its hoof, right? So there weren't any of those sorts of animals around, and I suspect that reflects the influence of the the prevention of cruelty to animals movement, right? And that's one of the reasons why you don't see many animals in circuses anymore, right? Because the animals weren't treated very well. It occurred to me while I was at this Buskers Festival that we treat wild animals like buskers now. The ones that we find cute and entertaining, we're willing to pay money for. So, for instance, the World Wildlife Federation has a panda as its icon. Everybody loves pandas, right? They're cute, they're not dangerous, they're kind of cuddly. I don't know if anyone's ever cuddled a panda, but they look like they could be cuddled, right? So they're a nice image to use as your icon for raising money for trying to save wildlife. And the Audubon Society, for instance, uses a beautiful picture of a heron in flight as its example, right? So people find herons inherently elegant, right? So long-legged and big, wide wingspan. And when people were denouncing hunting in the Arctic, they chose baby seals as their icon, right? Baby seals, are so cute. Those ones people do actually buy dolls of. And, there was a hue and cry over the clubbing of baby seals in the Arctic for a long time. And Ducks Unlimited has used the duck as its icon. Cute animals make it easier to raise money to protect animals. Ugly animals, however, the ones that we find scary or creepy, don't get used as icons for fundraising efforts. For instance, here's a picture of a creature from way, way down deep in the sea. Probably not going to be the poster child for Save the Oceans, right? There's a lot of really creepy, ugly animals out there, and we just don't want to hear about them, and we don't want to see about them. But that raises a question, because, nature wasn't created only with fuzzy, cuddly animals. There's lots of animals who are, frankly, from our perspective, ugly or creepy, or just, there doesn't seem to be any point to them, that we can't domesticate them, they're not good as pets, they're not good as scenery, so why do they exist? And that sort of attitude about what is it about animals that seem so distant from human concern, that's what today's reading from Job is about. This summer, a bunch of us read all of Job over the course of the summer, getting daily emails. And we talked, and we spent basically 2 months going through all of Job. And the story of Job, if you haven't read it lately, is Job is a man who has, in the space of one day, lost everything. He's lost his wealth, he's lost his family, and he's lost his health. He was a very rich man at first. He was very, very rich, very well respected. He had thousands of animals, goats and sheep and so forth, and in one day they're all wiped out. And on that same day, a great wind appears and knocks down the house where 10 of his 10 children have gathered, and they're all killed. And then, as if that's not enough misery, his body is covered in painful boils, so he's both ugly and in pain. So in one day, he's lost everything except for his life and his wife. What Job doesn't know is that the reason all these things have happened to him is because, according to the story, up in the court of heaven, one day, God and Satan made a bet. Satan was not, in the Job story, what we think of as Satan as, dwelling in hell, ruling all of the demons. Rather, Satan was one of the angels who just flies around the earth and is known as the accuser, the opponent of whoever you're with. So, if you've ever had a voice in your head saying, go ahead, eat that extra cupcake, or have another beer when you know you shouldn't, that's your Satan, okay? So that's what Satan is like. So Satan's been flying around, and God says, hey, what have you seen out there in the world? And Satan says, I've seen all sorts of things. And God says, well, what do you make of my servant Job? Righteous Job. He's a good man. And Satan says, is he though? You've given him everything. He's rich, he's popular, he's got lots of kids. Why shouldn't he love you? He's got everything he could possibly imagine. I bet if we took that stuff away, he would drop you like a hot stone. He would curse you. Because he doesn't really love you, he's not really loyal to you, he's just appreciative of all the good stuff you gave to him. So God says, I think you're wrong. So go ahead and take away everything he's got except for his life and his wife. So that's what Satan does. So that's why all those disasters befall Job. And Job is just miserable, and he wishes he'd never been born. And his wife says, just curse God and get it over with. But Job doesn't do that. Job doesn't do that, but he does complain a lot. And 3 or 4 of his friends come by, and they sit with him. And they tell him, you know what? There's no way this many bad things could have happened to you had it not been for you sinning in some way. You must have done something to deserve this, because God doesn't mete out this kind of punishment on people unless they've done something wrong. The story tells us very clearly that Job is innocent. Job, in his heart of hearts, thinks he's innocent too, so he demands an audience with God. The friends say, you're never going to get it because God is not going to visit a sinner like you. Just repent and then you can get good with God. But God proves them all wrong. God shows up in a whirlwind, and the voice of God starts to speak to Job, and that's where our reading came from today. And in this whirlwind speech, which, let's face it, if a whirlwind started talking to you, it'd be pretty terrifying. In this speech, God says, first, he's pretty intimidating. He says, who are you to talk to me? Who are you to ask me any questions? Were you there when I created the sun and the moon and the stars? Were you there when the morning stars sang on the first day of creation? So it sounds pretty intimidating and put-downish. But then the direction of God's answer to Job takes this weird left-hand turn, and he just starts talking about animals. And it's just example after example after example after example. And it's very strange, because he's not answering Job's direct question, why am I suffering? Why am I covered in boils? Why did I lose everything? He just talks about animals for a couple of chapters. And he talks about animals that human beings don't care about. He doesn't talk about the ones that we find cute and cuddly. He Doesn't talk about cats and dogs or pretty butterflies or beautiful hummingbirds, the kind of animals that we would say, oh yeah, that proves that God is great. Instead, he talks about the animals that are really far away and that it doesn't seem like there's any purpose to them from a human perspective. So he talks about ravens. Are you the one who feeds the ravens? Are you the one who feeds the lions when they're hungry? And then he gets into examples of animals who are really remote, like the wild ass in the desert wastes. The wild ass who will never work for any human being. Do you take care of them out in the desert? And the ostrich who I made without enough wisdom to cover up and keep its eggs safe so that other animals will trample them. That poor ostrich, who's not very bright, and yet when it runs, it feels the joy of being able to run faster than any horse and rider. Did you make them? Do you care for them? So God is going out of God's way to draw Job's attention away from mere human concerns into this more cosmic vision of how the world works. And he goes even further. A little bit further in this reading, he talks about two monsters who are loosely based on the hippopotamus and the crocodile. And he portrays them as monsters, the biggest land animal and the biggest sea creature, the Leviathan and the behemoth. And he says, they are so strong that no human being could ever tame them. No spear could ever puncture their skin or get through their scales. If you get near them, you know that you may be destroyed. They could trample you without thinking about it. And yet for me, they are like my pets, and I love them. He never says anything about the bet. Job never gets a straight answer from God. So why is he talking this way? Well, God seems to be giving Job not an answer, but a revelation. A revelation which is an invitation for Job to rise above just his human understanding of the world to a layer above, closer to the way God sees it. And in this, humans are just one species of many that God takes care of. And the presentation of how God sees creation is very different from the one that we're used to thinking about. If you consider the first couple books of Genesis, right? When God makes the world in 7 days, and God says, and you will have dominion over the earth. Job's book is saying, actually, the world would get along just fine without human beings. And it's kind of a counterpoint to the Genesis story. It makes us remember that humans are the very last species to be created in the book of Genesis. If humans had been left out, the world would still be able to function. And scholars debate whether that word in Hebrew, which we hear as dominion, it may have meant stewardship. That our task in this life is to be stewards of this earth, not its rulers. But of course, that's not the way we have interpreted that text. Especially in the last 500 years, we've seen the Genesis text as a license for us to just take over the earth and make this entire place ours. So much so that there's not really any wild places left. The wild ass in the desert breathes our contaminated air and is subject to global warming. At night, when the wild ass is walking about, if it pauses to look at the stars, it'll see the stars and the moon, but it'll also see satellites overhead. There's no escaping us now. This is our world. We are everywhere. Microplastics, everything has been infected or affected by us. But that attitude that we're in charge of everything, that we can be in control of everything, that attitude has led to the burning of the Amazon, the idea that the green belt is not protected, but should be developed and paved over as much as we like, as long as it makes some people money. It's the attitude which has poisoned our oceans with microplastics and is deafening the whales. I'm going to take God's cue here and go over here. And it makes us wonder, okay, so if that's what's going to happen, what should we do next? God's message in Job is that we are all united in God. The one common denominator underneath all of this creation, underneath animals that we don't see the point of, animals that are so bizarre and strange at the bottom of the deep sea, animals that live at the top of mountains, and us, is that we have all been created by God. That's our common denominator. We are invited, as always, to be compassionate. And we usually interpret that as being compassionate towards other human beings. And in the story of Job, Job's moral imagination grows over the course of the story so that he realizes he's not the only innocent person suffering, but there's other people suffering as well who are innocent. But now in the 21st century, we're being called for an even greater moral imagination. And I think in this way, the book of Job is a text that should be read a lot more in churches, because we need the wisdom of the book of Job, because basically we are now all Job. We have become so concerned about our own suffering that we have lost sight of the suffering of other species. And we are prepared to burn this planet down and just go on with business as usual as the average global temperature rises from 1.5 probably to 2, they're saying now. And it doesn't seem to matter to us what happens to the creatures of the deep or creatures that aren't cute and cuddly for us. If they can't busk for us, we don't really care. The book of Job is saying, no, caring is critical. If you are to actually live up to your full humanity, it means being concerned about more than just humans. God's answer to Job is an invitation to rise to a higher level of consciousness, which will actually enhance our humanity rather than constrain it. What we often hear of, I'm going to have to give up all these things if I'm going to try and curtail global warming. I think God's message to us is the only way for you to be truly loving human beings is to start showing that love towards all creatures, not just your own. And that enhanced humanity will be a blessing. And we hear it when we hear from indigenous people, right? Indigenous people have been saying forever, me and all my relations. But their relations, they don't just mean their aunties and their uncles. They mean the owls and the wolves and the bears and the plants and the stars and the moon. Because they realize to be human is to be rooted in all of that. And so like Job, we have been suffering and we've been demanding, why do we suffer? And God's answer to us, I think in this day and age, would be, you suffer because everything is suffering. If you could take it upon yourselves to worry about everything that suffers, your suffering and theirs will be reduced, and you will understand me much better than you ever have before. I think that is a blessing. Amen.